what's going to happen with my wife. I love my wife.
Hey, what's up everyone? Today we've got another update on the Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt cases. Law and Crime Network has posted a video discussing how Kevin Franke is now suing Jodi Hildebrandt for torturing his kids. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of background discussion in the comments and things like that about how Kevin Franke could be absent from his home for a year plus, not have contact with his family, and then feel like he can blame someone else or sue somebody else for the way that his kids were treated. If you do have some lingering questions about some of the thought process that goes into the ways that Jodi Hildebrandt, Ruby Franke, and Kevin Franke were justifying and reasoning out their actions, I definitely encourage you to check out my interview with Abby Maxwell Hansen, who is grown up Mormon, lives in the same county that the Frankes lived in, and is well acquainted with the teachings, both explicit and implicit, of the Mormon church that may have led to some of these issues. So I encourage you to check that out. But today we're diving into some of the parenting aspects of this case with Kevin Franke and with how he's now filing for divorce from Ruby Franke, as well as now suing Jodi Hildebrandt. So let's talk about some of the responsibilities that parents have compared to therapists. So make sure you like and subscribe, stay up to date with all of our content regarding this case, advocating for mental health in general. And as you all know, those subscriptions, those likes, those comments all help our channel to grow and build a stronger community together. So thank you all for your engagement with that. Let's dive into it.
Through the footage and the audio tapes, you come to learn that Ruby and Kevin, they had separated. He claimed this was due to the influence of Jodi on Ruby. He agreed to live separately from Ruby and the kids because he was told that would be best. He didn't know what was going on with Ruby or the kids. That's what he claims.
So let me pause real quick. So some of the background that I learned from Abby was that part of Jodi Hildebrandt's influence was that she was able to set the tone for the Mormon church when internet pornography came out and became a huge concern for this church that highly values sexual purity, for men especially abstaining from masturbation and porn. And what we've seen from both Abby's interview and from other cases, Jodi's go-to strategy was to not differentiate between different levels of porn usage or masturbation or any other kind of sexual sins that she would conceive of, but she labeled all of them under the category of porn addiction, whether you looked at it once or whether you looked at it every couple of hours. And so her technique for that was separating the men from their wives, separating the men from their families. And so if Kevin Franke and Ruby Franke, both being Mormon in a highly authoritarian kind of structure, are used to following instructions from somebody who has been validated by the highest authorities within the Mormon church to set the agenda for how to deal with sexual problems within the marriage, then yeah, it would make sense for him to take her at her word and say, okay, if you say this is the best, given that she's, you know, the professional counselor in the situation, the mental health professional, she's been recommended by the church to give them guidance in this regard, so she has both the blessing of the state and the church. Yeah, you're gonna do what she says, even if that does run counterintuitive to what you might think is right. And I don't plan for this to be a video defending Kevin Franke's actions. I think there's a lot of culpability all around for both Kevin, Ruby, and Jodi Hildebrandt. But a lot of this is about explaining how you might get to that point where there's been a year of absence from the home and he was okay with that, or at least okay enough to go along with it without contacting his family, without knowing where the kids were staying and what was going on with them.
And in fact, he claims that he was shocked to learn that Ruby and his kids were staying with Jodi, and he was even more shocked to learn about this abuse. Now, let's not forget, Ruby and Kevin, they were in the spotlight for years. They had started the popular 8 Passengers YouTube channel back in 2015. It documented the lives of them and their 6 children. Became quite controversial. Some of the parenting techniques came into question. And Kevin himself has received a lot of criticism online about the videos, but also how could he not know what was happening with his family? But I think the more you dig deeper into this case and you understand the power dynamics and kind of this warped world they were living in, you get a better understanding of, I don't want to use the word brainwashing, but in a way that's almost what it is. But anyway, you fast forward and Kevin has filed for divorce from Ruby, our understanding, actively fighting to regain custody of his kids. And he has put a lot of the blame on this on Jodi. In fact, I remember during the sentencing hearing, you actually see Kevin Franke nodding in court as Jodi's manipulation is being described. So with that in mind, Kevin has filed a lawsuit against Jodi Hildebrandt, and it was filed on his behalf by his attorney, Randy Kester, who we've interviewed here on Sidebar and on Law and Crime. So with that in mind, let's break this suit down, and let me just first say to you.
And so a lot of what I've learned from interviewing Abby, Jodi Hildebrandt took advantage of a vulnerability within the church. One of them being the highly authoritarian structure. You follow and do what you're told. You don't make waves, and you just follow along with what church authority says. And so once she aligned herself with the church authority, then she spoke with the ruling of the church, and her word was not to be questioned. And so that means when she sets the agenda for it, this is how we deal with what we label porn addiction, that is any use of pornography, any sexual deviance, and being recommended to families and couples who are dealing with these problems specifically. Then you run into those situations where husbands don't feel like they have any ground to stand on to question what she's saying, because that means you're also questioning the authority of the church, and maybe you're just trying to justify yourself and the wrong things that you're doing, and that means you're not actually repentant or trying to make amends for the wrong that you had done. It could very well be that Kevin thought he had no other recourse but to follow what Jodi said, no matter whether he personally agreed or disagreed with it. And now that she's kind of been disgraced and removed from that position of influence, now he has more of a leg to stand on to be able to push back on that, try to gain custody of the kids. And that, of course, like I said, there's plenty of blame and responsibility to go around in this case. A lot of people will say that, Kevin and Ruby Franke's parenting was already suspect and bordering, if not over the line, on abuse prior to any influence from Jodi Hildebrandt. So let's hear what this suit actually includes.
I am not surprised that we are seeing this lawsuit. Why? A, Kevin had already, months ago, filed a motion seeking restitution from Jodi Hildebrandt in connection with the ongoing mental health treatment for his children after what Jodi did. In fact, the court ordered that Jodi could sell her home, but has to place $100,000 in escrow to satisfy that restitution. So he wanted her to be on the hook for the help that these children need. But also B, now that the criminal case is over and Jodi has admitted guilt, it would be much easier to prove liability in a civil case. That's
what I was thinking of. So yes, we've talked about the restitution before. So that's supposed to cover the ongoing mental health care, or I guess any other care for these kids that have resulted from Jodi and Ruby's torture of them. And now this civil case sounds somewhat like a malpractice suit, where she has admitted her guilt in this child abuse, and now it becomes a lot easier to use that guilty plea as evidence that she was practicing unethically in her role as a therapist for these kids. Now, this is something that I've been confused about, but that's just kind of the nature of the mixed up relationships that Jodi Hildebrandt had with this family. I know she started initially as a therapist for Chad, I believe, and then extended to the entire family, which already is an issue. If you start working with someone individually and then you start working with the family, there might be some compromise of your objectivity because you've been working with an individual first and you're used to seeing them as your client. You might see them differently or have their viewpoints in mind when you're trying to be objective towards the family. In addition to that, she created this business relationship with Ruby Franke, where Ruby Franke was on her connections platform and coaching and all of this stuff. So you have business interests tied up with this relationship now, and then you have the kids staying with Jodi Hildebrandt, and she's providing some kind of pseudo caregiving or parenting on top of all of that. It's just all these relationships are really mixed up, and it's hard to figure out what her actual responsibility and role for this family was, because she had gone way past what was actually supposed to be done by her as any family therapist. And so I think those are also arguments that could be made for there to be a case for malpractice and practicing unethically on top of just the way she was torturing the kids, which obviously shouldn't have been done anyway.
That's my opinion. Well, let's get into the complaint. So after laying out the parties and the court's jurisdiction over this, the complaint lays out the facts of the case. And it says, quote, while plaintiff was residing in Utah County, beginning on or about May 22nd, 2023, defendant, in collaboration with plaintiff's then wife, Ruby Franke, also mother of these 4 children, moved the 4 minor children to defendant's home in Ivins, Utah. So all 4 children were there. Remember, this was during their parents' separation. Quote, neither defendant nor Ruby Franke advised plaintiff of the removal of the children from the family home in Springville, Utah, to defendant's home in Ivins, Utah. Again, according to Kevin, he had no idea what was happening with Franke and his kids at this time.
I will say that, like, when I do work with families, even if the parents are separated or divorced, I do advocate a lot of communication between the two parents, because whether or not you two like each other, you're still raising the same kids together, and you need to be able to communicate about, this is what I'm doing with the kids, this is something that we're focusing on, these are our goals for the kids, how can we work together even from separate homes, and maybe philosophical differences about how we live our lives or how we parent. How can we make sure that these kids are getting consistent messages? And obviously even the most basic of communication, where the kids are residing and who they're staying with, who's responsible for them, was not communicated to Kevin Franke. So I don't know if that's an unethical move by Jodi Hildebrandt necessarily, but it is definitely problematic if you're talking about trying to encourage productive co-parenting between parents who are separated for whatever reason.
Then Kevin Franke incorporates into this complaint almost verbatim the disturbing details of abuse that were laid out in Ruby and Jodi's plea agreements about these two youngest children. By the way, we're talking about EF and RF. EF was 9 years old, and RF, this abuse occurred over the span of when he was 11 to 12. So these two youngest children were confined to the home. The women inflicted serious physical injuries on the children. There was torture. There was physical labor. They were standing out in the heat, denial of food and water, isolation. Franke's son was tied up. They were told that they were evil, that they had to repent. The kids were emaciated. They suffered severe wounds. Honestly, I don't even want to go into it any further. We have already done that so many times, but you get the idea. And from there, the complaint goes on to say how...
This is where I think a lot of commenters lose it in terms of, like, how can a mother justify this kind of treatment of her children? And so again, I'll refer you to Abby Maxwell Hansen's interview. The link will be in the description below. But basically, there's a lot of religious background and implicit teaching about demonic possession, spirits, and those kinds of spiritual battles that made that kind of mindset right for Jodi Hildebrandt to take over and say, yeah, torturing is actually the best thing for your kids right now, and for someone to actually believe it and buy into it. It sounds crazy, but the full explanation is on the video linked below. So check that out if you have questions about that. I do think the really difficult part, I know some people will argue with me on how sincere Kevin Franke is in all of this and the arguments that he's making in these lawsuits and these statements. But as a father, if I were doing something as extreme as separating myself from my family, if I legitimately believe that that was what was needed in order for our family to heal, I don't think I would ever get to that point. But if I actually believed that, and then I came back to find out that this is what was happening to my children, and that in my absence, things had gotten more serious, they were being tortured, they were being forced to work out in the sun without being provided adequate shelter, shade, water, food, all of those things, I really don't know how I would react to all that. Again, there are people who question the legitimacy of Kevin Franke's parenting and his intentions in all of this. But to put yourself in a situation where you're coming back and the people who told you you have to leave for the good of the kids are doing this to the kids, man, I would be pissed about that. That would be infuriating to find out.
When Ruby's son was finally able to escape and run to that neighbor's home, this son, RF, quote, requested from the neighbor food, water, and that law enforcement be called so he could be taken to jail. This latter request was because he had been so indoctrinated by defendant that if he escaped, he would go to jail.
And this is where we get into more of the malpractice stuff, is that we as therapists, again, I don't think Jodi Hildebrandt was acting as their therapist anymore in this case. She had so many roles with this family that therapist was like the last on the list. But we are in this position where we can help shape our clients' beliefs. And it's not always with kids, but I do this with adults, families, parents as well. We have this training that helps us to understand somebody's worldview and help them to shape it in a way that works better for them. And she twisted that in a way so unethically to instill fear and control over these kids, over Ruby Franke and so many other couples and families that were damaged by the way that Jodi Hildebrandt applied the skills that she had learned, the trust that she had been given by the State Board of Licensing, as well as the Mormon Church, to tear these families apart for whatever twisted reasons that she had, to use her position to instill fear and try to manipulate and control instead of trying to help.
That is a theme in these abuse cases, and we've talked about it before, that the victims are made to believe that they are the ones who did something wrong. The complaint goes on to say, quote, instead of jail, however, of course, he was cared for by first responders and eventually admitted to the hospital for severe malnourishment, his body being emaciated, and for treatment of his many and serious wounds and injuries. Then the complaint talks about EF, Ruby's young daughter, and describes something that we saw on body cam video. Quote, after searching defendant's home, EF was eventually located in a closet of the home, sitting on the floor. First responders and law enforcement found her in an emaciated, food-deprived condition, and although conscious, was so emotionally traumatized and afraid that she would not communicate with them. Only after hours of reassuring her safety, calming her fears, and offering her food, she ate an entire pizza and part of another, were they able to coax her out of the closet so she could be taken to the hospital to treat her injuries, malnourishment, and emotional state. Yeah, that was some of the most harrowing footage that we saw. And the officer initially, by the way, believed that EF was a boy because her hair was so short. There was evidence to suggest from Ruby's journal entries that she cut her daughter's hair as a form of punishment. We cover a lot of lawsuits here on Sidebar, like this one from Kevin Franke. The complaint explains that the Department of Child and Family Services took custody of the kids, quote, in order to address professionally the emotional and psychological condition of the children, which had been so seriously and adversely manipulated and indoctrinated. The children are residing in separate homes while in state's custody.
Okay, I want to talk about this because Kevin Franke has filed to have custody of the children, is my understanding. And of course, the debate is very split on whether he should or should not have custody of the kids. Even if he were to be a perfect parent from this point onward, a claim that I am not making, hypothetically, if he were the ideal parent going forward, the kids would still have difficulty because they had seen him be absent for a year. And there must have been times where they might have imagined, where is dad in all of this? Why isn't he coming in to rescue us? Why isn't he doing anything to stop what mom and this crazy lady are doing? So there would be a lot of confusion, potentially a lot of trauma, and a lot of really difficult conversations when the kids get older about what his role is. And there could be a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a lot of fear even, that could really pollute the parent and child relationship. And again, we don't know for sure how much Kevin Franke actually assented to the kind of treatment that the kids were getting. His absence leaves a gap that we can only kind of interpret because there are so many ways to interpret a lack of response. So I'm no expert on like custody law or anything like that, but I will say that regardless of whether Kevin Franke actually gets custody or not, he's going to have a very difficult path forward with these children no matter what his relationship ends up being with them, whether he gets custody of them or not.
Didn't know that they're separated. That is very, very sad to think about, that they're not together. And this part is especially tough. Quote, the children's personalities, emotions, and psyches were so damaged and altered that it was beyond father's capability to restore them without professional intervention of state's resources through the juvenile court. This through a rehabilitation and restorative process directed and prescribed by the professionals treating the children. In order to restore his children to his care in their family home, meaning how he's going to get back custody, father himself has complied with the court process and has affirmatively sought his own regimen of professional therapy in order to coordinate not only with the children's treatment providers, but to gain an understanding of his children's conditions and needs and how to best facilitate the restoration of all of his children back to their former status as happy and healthy individuals and of a happy and intact family.
Ooh, that is a tough statement. Let me break this down a little bit because I think there's a lot of legalese. And I want to examine that not through a legal lens, but through a mental health lens. So that first statement is talking about the trauma that everyone involved in the case had experienced. Obviously, there was the direct physical, emotional, and mental trauma that the kids experienced at the hands of Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke. And so, yeah, absolutely, that is beyond probably any one individual's ability to restore without professional intervention. And I will say that second statement, through a rehabilitation and restorative process directed and prescribed by the professionals treating the children, after their experience with Jodi Hildebrandt, I can't imagine how anyone in this family has any trust in mental health professionals. For them to be going through that process, I think if I were someone treating the kids or even treating Kevin Franke, as he talks about he's getting his own therapy, that would be a point I hammer home a lot. Thank you for trusting me in this process. I want to respect your autonomy. I want to respect your goals. Be very careful about anything that I tell you to do, because you're putting a lot of trust in me just by showing up and being a part of this process, given what you've experienced at the hands of another mental health professional. I think there is some good insight here that he himself is engaging in therapy. Now, I don't know who his treatment provider is. I don't know what their credentials are, but the idea that he has some things that he needs to work through himself, and it's not just the kids to work through and him, supporting them in that, but that he has his own issues that he needs to talk about, develop a plan for, and himself be ready to be a parent again. I think that's a very productive attitude to bring to that process. I will say I don't like that last bit of the statement, restoration of all his children back to their former status as happy and healthy individuals. A lot of commenters have talked about this, and I kind of agree with it, that they're not going back to the way they were before. And that's not a defeated or hopeless sense, but just that trauma has a way of transforming our lives. What we're hoping for in trauma is that we can heal and we can tell the story without being owned emotionally by the story, or that we can relay that story as part of our story, but not the entire narrative. But that it was a definite inflection point and turning point in their lives. There's a lot of innocence, happiness, and carefreeness that those kids are probably not getting back. It's really sad to say, because of so many different choices that these adults had made, these adults that the kids had trusted, which again is going to be another point. How do these kids deal with authority figures now? With fear, with rejection, with lack of trust? There's a lot that going forward, I doubt that the kids will be able to blindly trust an adult or an authority figure again. That's what trauma does to you. That's not to say there isn't some measure of healing that can be gained through good therapy and through time and healing, through a supportive atmosphere, but just wanting everything to go back to the way it was before Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke got involved with all of this is an unrealistic expectation.
In their family home. In other words, it will take a lot of work for both Kevin and the kids to get back to themselves and a path of recovery after all of this. And it seems like he is doing everything the court is asking him to do, including seeking help himself. The complaint then says, quote, "The intentional and or negligent acts of the defendant have completely damaged and altered for the worse Kevin's marriage," the children's mother is in prison, "all of his children's individual psyches, personalities, and behaviors, essentially dismantling, exploding his family and his personal life." And Kevin goes on to state that the consequence of what Jodi did was foreseeable. Foreseeability is such a major element in these kinds of civil suits. You knew this would happen, or you should have known this would happen.
Oh, I didn't know about this legal aspect. Okay, foreseeability. Could Jodi Hildebrandt have foreseen or predicted that her actions would have caused some of these things to happen? Given that she was intentionally telling Kevin to leave the house, intentionally torturing the kids, if she had even taken one class in psychology or counseling or mental health, she would have known that trauma is a thing, can result from the extreme tortures that she put the kids through. So yeah, absolutely. This checks the box for foreseeability.
Which brings me to the actual claims or causes of action in the lawsuit. Under what theories is he suing? Okay, cause of action number one, intentional infliction of emotional distress. This is a very broad kind of legal claim. And what he's arguing here is that Jodi engaged in, quote, severe and intolerable conduct and acted with, quote, reckless disregard of the probability of causing emotional distress to Kevin and the kids. So
I'll just say she wasn't even playing probabilities there. A lot of her actions were intended to cause emotional distress so that she could shape both Kevin and Ruby, as well as the kids' beliefs, to match what she wanted.
You don't have to show that Jodi intended to cause Kevin or the kids emotional distress. Not that she necessarily wanted that to occur, but that she recklessly disregarded the chances of Kevin and the kids suffering emotional distress because of what she did. And he says he did, in fact, suffer emotional distress. And And as a direct and proximate result of defendant's wrongful actions and omissions, Kevin has suffered past and future economic, non-economic damages, pain and suffering, emotional distress, loss of quality of life, and loss of enjoyment of life. So damages, by the way, that's money. That's
interesting that the phrasing, I don't know how verbatim he's quoting all of that, but a lot of it seems framed as Jodi Hildebrandt did X to Kevin Franke, which seems a little limiting considering how if he could write it on behalf of his kids, that there would be a much more solid case for that. Maybe we're getting to that later. I don't know.
what you should be compensated. And the causation element, the direct and proximate result, that's causation. What Jodi did caused Kevin's harm. And this is what that harm is, and this is what he lost. All essential in a civil claim. Cause of action number 2. This is an alternative take. It is negligent infliction of emotional distress. So negligence is about reasonableness. And here it's that Jodi engaged in conduct that she should have known would create an unreasonable risk of causing emotional distress to Kevin.
That's an important point too. Like I said, a lot of this seemed to be very intentional and not negligent. But there are some times, maybe less so with therapy, but we're balancing risks and rewards. There are some times where there might be a potential risk, but do the benefits or the potential benefits outweigh the risks? And so I'll do a light version of this with some of my clients where if they're kind of marginal cases where they might benefit some from therapy, but they're also struggling to make ends meet in terms of paying their bills and things like that, are the potential benefits of them continuing counseling with me worth the potential risks of them losing their house, not being able to put food on the table? Thankfully, I've never had a case where it was that extreme that clients were forced to one choice or another. But that's some of the weighing of the risks and benefits. You know, Jodi Hildebrandt might be able to pull out some random psychological theory or religious theory where like there might have been some potential, like 0.0001% chance that this would benefit the kids in some way. But the likelihood of harm and damage to the kids was so much more likely, obviously, that she can't justify that course of action. And that's why it's so important when you're asking your therapist what they're doing in terms of interventions, asking if it's evidence-based, because that weighs some of the potential pros and cons, the risks versus the rewards, and how likely it is for you to get a positive outcome versus what it might cost you.
It's not about intent. Again, causation's there, that as a result of what she did, he suffered harm. And that same idea leads into the third and final claim or cause of action listed in this lawsuit, negligence. So Jodi had a legal duty with respect to Kevin and the kids to act reasonably under the circumstances, and she breached that duty of care. That she breached it, and that caused Kevin harm. And like the
Yeah, I'll dig into this real quick because as a licensed professional counselor or whatever it's called in Utah, the analogous position, you are held to a certain standard of care because you're a medical professional or a mental health professional. And ostensibly you've received the training, the ethical training, and all through internships, residency, being supervised, that you're held to a higher standard of being able to assess, being able to treat, and being able to intervene in a responsible manner, and to know the interventions that you're using are evidence-based, what the potential risks and rewards are, and to be able to explain that so the client can have informed consent about that. And Jodi Hildebrandt violated that in so many ways, first using obviously not evidence-based approaches to intervene with problems that didn't even exist, as well as very much not getting the consent of anyone involved. Once her foot was in the door in terms of being a therapist to this family, it was her way or the highway.
The other counts, this caused economic, non-economic damages, pain, suffering, emotional distress, loss of quality of life, and loss of enjoyment of life. Now, there is another interesting component towards the end of this lawsuit that I want to call out. And it says, pursuant to the Utah Rules of Civil Procedure 8A, that, by the way, sets out what you have to lay out in a complaint to make a legal claim against another. So it's like requirements you have to put in a pleading in a complaint. So it goes on to say, so pursuant to 8A and 26C3, this matter falls under Tier 3 and should be permitted discovery pursuant to Tier 3. So I actually looked this up. Under Utah law, my understanding is what this means is that lawsuits that are claiming $300,000 or more in damages, which Kevin seems to be claiming here, you will be granted Tier 3 discovery. So there is a chart by tiers in Utah, and it lays out the hours needed for depositions, the days to complete discovery, how many requests you get for evidence, and so forth. Well, Tier 3 grants you more time and grants you more requests, basically. So it's advantageous for Kevin to be Tier 3. Now, it's hard to say what Jodi will do with this lawsuit, how she will respond to this lawsuit. I imagine that there is more money that Kevin believes Jodi has here. Otherwise, why would you sue? After all, it was reported that her house that she was permitted to sell was worth over $5 million. So there seems to be a legal avenue to get the money that he believes he and the kids are entitled to. We will, of course, continue to monitor this lawsuit and any developments in the Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt saga.
Well, I'm glad he looked that up because I would not have understood it even if I looked that up. So that seems more kind of a legal aspect to the situation. But some of the final thoughts I have are that whether or not you think Kevin Franke is culpable in all of this, he does not have to be a saint in order to file a malpractice suit against Jodi Hildebrandt. There were basic standards of care that Jodi Hildebrandt should have been held to as a practicing mental health professional and inhabiting that role with the Franke family, along with others. She was acting unethically, and all of that opens her up to being sued for malpractice, even if there are other people who are responsible. So I don't think this video is meant to explain, oh, Kevin Franke has, 20% of the fault, Ruby Franke has X%, and then Jodi Hildebrandt has the bulk of the blame. No, I don't think that's the point of the justice system or for the civil case for that matter. But the fact was that she had a responsibility to the family. She very much abused that responsibility. The kids were hurt because of that, and he's seeking to file suit because of her malpractice. So I do think, akin to kind of the Ruby Franke statement that we covered earlier this year, Kevin Franke is at least saying the right things in this suit, saying that he's pursuing counseling of his own, recognizing the harm that has been done to him as well as to his kids, and finding resources to be able to support him and his kids as best as he can. Whether or not that means they end up together or whether someone else has custody of them, that's not being settled yet. But there is a lot that's still going on even after Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt have had their sentencing hearings and are incarcerated for the time being. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Again, if you're interested in some of the Mormon underpinnings, beliefs, and implicit teachings that have led to some of these crazy abuses, please check out the interview with Abby Maxwell Hansen. So again, please do like and subscribe. This helps the channel to grow and help us continue making great content for you all. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I'll see you all next time.